The emotional reaction would be that let's just stop. They have wronged us. But emotions should not take over rationality ever. Because and generally in Indian foreign policy, which has a very thick skin and a very long term view, we tend to avoid emotional decisions. This is our neighborhood. If we get tied down to it, no, all the momentum that we have right now for the rising stature of India in geopolitics or geoeconomics, no conversation in any part of the world is now complete without a mention of India, be it in Europe, be it in the US for whatever reasons, be it even in China, be it in Russia. Nothing is complete without India. If we get tied down to the neighborhood and keep dousing the flames, it's going to be problematic.
In geopolitics, the most important stories are rarely the loudest ones. They unfold quietly across oceans, through trade routes, naval movements, and a strategic partnership that don't always make headlines but shape the future of power. Welcome to another episode of the podcast, The Long View, one of the initiatives of the Subhash Chandra Bose Chair of International Relations at Chanakya University. I'm your host, Nishit Kumar. The Long View is a platform where we step back from the noise and look at the bigger picture. Today, we are diving into one of the India's most important yet often under discussed strategic ideas, SAGAR, acronym for Security and Growth for All in the Region, launched by Prime Minister Modi in 2015, and its evolution into Mahasagar, Mutual and Holistic Advancement for Security across the regions in 2025. He also highlighted that the IOR is one of my foremost policy priorities. What does it really mean for India to be the maritime power? Is this our cooperation or competition? And how does this vision play out in a region increasingly shaped by China, crisis, and vulnerabilities? To unpack all of this, we have someone who has spent years studying China, strategy, and the Indo Pacific in depth, Dr. Parna Pathak. Namaste.
Namaste.
She is Professor of China Studies at Jindal School of International Studies, and she is also the founding director of Center for Northeast Asian Studies. Her work sits at the intersection of China's foreign policy, Indo-Pacific strategy, and global power dynamics. She has also previously worked as a consultant with India's Ministry of External Affairs and also been associated with leading think tanks such as ORF. Dr. Pathak's research spans issues from China's global presence to the evolving strategic architecture of the Indo-Pacific. She is also the author of book Drifts and Dynamics, Russia's Ukraine War and Northeast Asia, and is currently working on a project examining India's maritime vision under SAGAR. Namaste. It is a real privilege to have you with us today to help us take a deeper understanding of India's maritime strategy. Dr. Pathak, let me start with a very basic question, but important one. When India talks about Sagar, what does it actually mean in practice? And why did India feel the need to articulate this in 2015?
Thank you so much, Dr. Kumar, and thank you, Chanakya University. It's wonderful to engage on such a pertinent topic. Coming quickly to your question, see, Sagar is best described or understood as an overarching vision which doubles as a very flexible diplomatic instrument for cooperative maritime engagement. Now, it's not a rigid military doctrine or a white paper, but it is a vision for showcasing India's role as a responsible maritime power in the Indian Ocean region and beyond. Now, why did we have to do it in 2015? See, Sagar emphasizes five core aspects of safety and security of India and its islands, a safe and secure and stable Indian Ocean region, security cooperation, economic cooperation, especially with littoral states, our maritime neighbors, and island states, and building capacity. We also believe in collective action. Now, this had to be showcased as India's, interest started increasing more and more, and the alignments with our smaller neighbors, with the island states, became more visible. there was a need for us to articulate it. So Sagar functions as a very broad vision, and what India has also done through this, or hopes to do, is to project its right role as a net security provider in the Indian Ocean region. And for this purpose, India has undertaken some key implementations like maritime capacity building, through patrol vessels, through training, multilateral exercises like the Milan, or IORA engagements, partnerships focused on economy, trade, and so on. Now, given that Indo Pacific is now another huge flashpoint for a conflict, and it is very important for trade, and several lines of trade, sea lanes of communication pass through that, it is important that the fastest growing major economy, which is India, and a responsible actor like India has a vision in place so that partners who have similar visions can align, and it becomes more explicit, and we can actually navigate crisis much better. So this thing is it's Indian Ocean region centric, but it has linkages to broader Indo-Pacific strategies, and India has been using it to counter newer challenges like piracy or threats from non-traditional actors, external assertiveness, while prioritizing regional-led stability. So, all in all, while there were so many things which were unfolding, it was important to get all of them under one umbrella. That umbrella became Sagar.
Okay, I will just pick your brain because you have mentioned it as a doctrine also, a vision also. So, for our audience, how should we understand Sagar? Is it a doctrine, a vision, or a diplomatic instrument?
See, there's no standalone Sagar doctrine. There is no such explicit document. Sagar operates through practical initiatives like be it naval diplomacy, integration into India's broader foreign policy, security policy, and so on. Also, Sagar last year evolved into Mahasagar, or Mutual and Holistic Advancement for Security and Growth across the regions, expanded from just regional Indian Ocean region focus to wider global outreach. So it's not a doctrine, it's not a white paper, it's more of a vision which doubles down as a very flexible diplomatic instrument. If you see all the statements also which have come up in the past from many different leaders from our country, never do we ever say that it's a doctrine or a white paper. It's not a military strategy. While military and security do form components of it, it is more of an overarching vision. So I think vision would be the best way to describe what Sagar/Mahasagar is.
Thank you, Dr. Patak. So, Sagar is a vision. Now, let's move to what Sagar means for India's neighborhood. Country like Sri Lanka. India always stepped in with about $4 billion during Sri Lanka crisis in 2022. In 25, India launched Operation Sagar Bandhu as HADR, Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief, to help Sri Lanka fight with devastating impacts of Cyclone Ditwa. Indian naval ships, INS Vikrant, INS Udayagiri, INS Sukanya, and Indian Air Force delivered more than 1,000 tons of food, clothing, 4 tons of medicines. NDRF and Indian Navy assisted in evacuating civilians. India always stepped in, but China still has Hambantota. What does that tell us about the limits of Sagar?
Very interesting question. So, coming first into India showcasing itself as a net security provider, and as you correctly gave so many examples, we have engaged this. Now, India's practices, be it through Sagar/Mahasagar or outside it, is never predatory. India has gifted or has, either it has gifted or it has shared coastal radar systems, or has been constructing patrol vessels, training programs for neighbors like Mauritius, Seychelles, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and so on. Now, the Indian Navy and the Coast Guard, they operationalize these actions via regular HADR or humanitarian and disaster response missions. China is not there. Whenever a crisis happens, just the way it was during Cyclone Ditwa, India is the first respondent.
True.
Arguably, yes, it is close by, but also there's a question about responsibility. given that China has been trying to showcase itself as a responsible actor to India's neighbors. The question is that when countries are really in distress, where is China, right? So India has been there. It has forever been there. This is not the first instance, be it in during Nepal's earthquake or during any sort of water crisis in Maldives. India is always there as the first respondent. Over and above that, also, we have delivered vaccines, food aid, relief during the COVID-19 or during cyclones in Mauritius, Madagascar, Mozambique, and Sri Lanka. India has tried and created maritime domain awareness, and it's done operationally through the IFC IOR, which was established in 2018. And India has shared real time data with 28 partners to combat piracy, illegal fishing, and trafficking. Uh, do we often talk about it? India's style is maybe it comes from our personal culture, which is neki kar darya mein dal. And one can never really say that our foreign policy or any country's foreign policy can ever be disassociated from the large personal cultures of the people. So some of this also ends up being showcased in our the lack of projection of the good things which we have done. So, which is why Sagar was important, because at least some sort of enlisting of whatever we've done should be there. It is great to do, neki kar darya mein dal is great. But unfortunately, when one keeps doing things, but another actor with malicious motives comes in and showcases itself as the better actor, that is where it really goes wrong. You mentioned Humban Tota Port. Now, that is, I would say, a strategy to rewrite the rules based international order. Because if you see traditionally, when we engage in borrowing and lending, it is based on written principles. We do not take sovereign territory. And even though China says it has been leased out, it's been leased out for 99 years. Who amongst us is living for 99 years? I don't think a child born today also would live till 99 years. So, for all purposes, it is the PRCs. But let's look at the silver lining. What it also showcases is that when India lends or extends a line of credit, it is not predatory. Things are listed out. Interest rates would be listed out. If there's a default, what happens would be listed out. And never ever is it a territory grab. Territory grabs are seen as difficult or things which should be avoided in international law. And over the years, since the Second World War, countries, institutions have come up and tried to prevent territorial grabs. It does happen, I'm not denying that. But rewriting the rules that we play by, say for example, tomorrow I say, Dr. Kumar, can you lend me your pen? And you do. And I take it. And for whatever reason, I lose it. And then you say, Dr. Pathak, now that you've lost it, I didn't tell you this, but you have to give me your year. It's not okay, right? Something like
Yes.
that. So let's look at the silver lining. It also showcases that India is not predatory. We create sustainable development, things which our partners actually need. So that's where we stand.
Okay. So, in respect of Sri Lanka, I just have a small question about Setu Samundram. Do you think it is going to materialize in near future? Okay. Moving on to another country in our neighborhood, Maldives. India is Maldives, one of the largest development partners. Projects include Greater Malay Connectivity Project. Yet, we have seen India out campaigns. Does Saga sometimes create political backlash?
See, India out campaigns, we've seen it. It's not something new. We've seen it in multiple different countries, Maldives being one of them. Again, there is a lot of influence creation, and it's done very subtly. Most great powers of the world do it. China definitely does it. So if you go back and trace the origins of the India Out campaign, be it in Maldives or be it in Bangladesh, the fact is that subtle peddling of the narratives using social media or discourses or narrative pushing did happen. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, whichever way that we might see it, the thing is that we have South Asia, India and its neighborhood has positive demographics, which means that we have significant amount or numbers of youth who basically get all sorts of information or rely on the internet. Internet is no longer something which is a luxury, it is a necessity. Now, if you constantly keep inflaming things using the internet or creating mindsets, let's go back, say, maybe 20 or 30 years. We end up becoming the sort of people based on the sorts of books that we used to read, right? It'll also shape your mentality and your ideology and all sorts of those things and your worldview.
Agree.
Now, when we have shifted to the more digital age and people are reading online, again, the sort of material that you're exposed to does shape your mentality, does shape your mindset, and so on. So, if you look at the beginnings of the India Out campaign, a lot of them do get traced to either bots, emerging from China, or concerted efforts from the PRC, and so on. Why would the PRC do this, right? Because unfortunately, there is a saying in Chinese, and you know it better than I do: one mountain cannot have two tigers. In terms of theory, it is said that for any country to be the hegemon or the leader of the international system, it first has to establish regional hegemony. Now, of course, the China wants to, replace the US as the leader of the international system. And there is no India angle to this at all. It's a bigger thing going on between the US and China. But if China wants to do that, first it has to establish regional hegemony. Which region does it live in? In Asia. In Asia, there is another tiger, which is currently the world's fastest growing major economy, has more and better credentials worldwide, has more acceptability. How do you ensure that it doesn't become a threat for your regional hegemony? Keep it tied down to the neighborhood. Keep your neighbor's fences burning so that he or she is constantly dousing the flames. So that's what it is. Coming back to Sagar, because we aim at sustainability, we do not impose rules. We actually engage with our partners and find out what exactly would it be which they would need. And that's how we engage. See, for example, in Sri Lanka, we create schools so that it's a long term. As they say, if you want a person to be fed, teach him or her to fish, right? We teach to fish so that he or she can learn to fish and get access to food forever. Coming to fish, when Sri Lanka was in debt distress, when it had to lease out, quote unquote, lease out Hambantota, had to go out to IMF to seek relief, India not only extended lines of credit, but also understood what could be it that the population requires. What did we give? And this is just a few examples. Fishing nets. Why fishing nets? Because coastal community, right? They would need fishing nets for survival. Fair enough. Can we, let's assume as taxpayers, you and I, whatever money we do give, that also goes into India's foreign aid. We have given fishing nets, right? Can we retrieve fishing nets? No, right? That's how India's policies are. What we also did is we gave anti-malaria vaccines because as a country in the similar neighborhood, climatic conditions, we understand that malaria is a challenge. People would need vaccines. So that, and now that the country is in distress, the government is in distress, the people need help. So let's step in with things which the people need. So there is no pushback against this, and we are not extractive. It's not, extractive sort of diplomacy. I'll go back quickly to your question on the Setu Samudram, the shipping canal project. It has been in certain sorts of legal difficulties. And unfortunately, it is stalled as of 2026 because of, ongoing legal hurdles, environmental issues, sensitivities, and lack of central government momentum as well. It wants to create 167 kilometers of shipping canal in the Park Strait between Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka, wants to link the Gulf of Mannar and Park Bay. This would actually help both the countries. But then there are issues which Sri Lanka has raised. And, I think there would be talks, but at the moment, it's not a primary concern, which is being discussed to sort it out and India doesn't push things down other partners' throats. So if a country raises objections, we listen to it, we agree to it, we leave it on the back burner, and we decide that we'll come back to it, and we will have discussions and so on. There have been no major updates or restarts in the last 2 years because there are other things which India is doing together with Sri Lanka, and the focus is on those sorts of things at the moment.
Okay. So India just keep provide assistance, but don't do neki kar darya mein dal. We should also put our narrative outside. So in Maldives, 2 years back in 2024, Prime Minister Modi met Maldivian President Mohammad Muizu and also provided emergency financial assistance of around 100 million USD bilateral currency swap. So, what is your take on that? That after India Out campaign, we are still assisting our neighbors.
See, that's the beauty of engaging with India. See, one can act very vitriolic about this and say that, well, you wanted India out, so be it. Let's look at this from two perspectives, one emotional and one rational. If the country does go into doldrums, which country? The country that is creating the problems is going to come in and will take over assets. And this is our neighborhood. Do we want that country, which has proven time and again that it's a threat actor? So what do we do over here? We continue engaging. We wait because, karma has its own ways. And unfortunately, I keep seeing traces of it in foreign policy as well. Well, if India Out has been inflamed and it has been stated by the president as it was, the costs of it also get visible very soon, because the other actor then goes on a hyper mode and it entrenches its tentacles even deeper, which is what happened. And then the India Out campaign on its own got flushed out. And then Mr. Muizu, well, also there was a meeting, as you said, between Prime Minister Modi and him, and we extended a line of credit so that it doesn't fall into deeper troubles. The emotional reaction would be that let's just stop. They have wronged us. But emotions should not take over rationality ever, because and generally in Indian foreign policy, which has a very thick skin and a very long-term view, we tend to avoid emotional decisions. This is our neighborhood. If we get tied down to it, all the momentum that we have right now for the rising stature of India in geopolitics or geoeconomics, no conversation in any part of the world is now complete without a mention of India, be it in Europe, be it in the US for whatever reasons, be it even in China, be it in Russia. Nothing is complete without India. If we get tied down to the neighborhood and keep dousing the flames, it's going to be problematic. So we continue and showcase that, well, this is what the Indian approach is. However, I'm very sure our diplomats and our leadership have also done this. Maybe behind the doors also communicated that, look, we have red lines. Please do not keep crossing our red lines. We are friends and we'll always behave as friends. And we've been the lender of last resort. We are the net security provider, but there are red lines. So I believe these have been communicated.
So India's foreign policy is pragmatic and practical. Professor Pathak, you have recently visited Mauritius. How much Mauritius matter for Mahasagar? If Sagar had a geography center of gravity, it would be probably Mauritius.
Absolutely, yes. Which is why, the announcement also was in Mauritius, right? Whichever country is engaging or showcasing its projects or its vision, as Sagar/Mahasagar is, it chooses the countries of announcement strategically, which is why the BRI was announced in two separate countries, one in ASEAN and one in Southeast Asia and one in Central Asia. For us, Mauritius, because of its geopolitical position, it is that important. The announcement happened there. Now, even this year, because conflicts unfortunately have become the norm of the day, when I did visit Mauritius, things are difficult because the blockage of the Straits of Hormuz is creating difficulties even for Mauritius, as it is for the US, as well as the Chinese, as well as any other actor in the world. So Mauritius has now to rethink what does it do? Because it's a tourism-based economy, you know. The population is of Indian origin, or a significant amount of it. This is indentured labor, or their previous generations who were taken, and significant parts of it of that labor were taken from Bihar. Now, these are their people. Now, there are other ethnicities and groupings and so on as well. But it's a tourism oriented economy. At best, they would export some sort of jaggery, sugarcane, those sorts of primarily agricultural goods. Now, it is important because, anti piracy is still a thing. And if, given that we already have active crisis, one is happening in West Asia, we don't want another one happening in across the Taiwan Straits. There have been certain justice missions and those sorts of things across the Taiwan Straits and so on. It is important for India to have a bigger role in Mauritius and have a bigger partnership. Mauritius is a partner in the Indian Ocean Region Dialogue, in the IORA, and so on. So discussions are happening as to how we want to get out of this current West Asian crisis unscathed, and what do we really do if another one emerges. So it is Mauritius is important for India also to showcase as to how our anti-piracy efforts, HADRs, and all of these sorts of things are very important. So Mauritius is in a difficult spot right now thanks to the crisis, but it remains important more than ever, especially if we look at it from the lenses of Sagar and Mahasagar.
Is it more important now because of its location and our expansion from Sagar to Mahasagar? Because when we were talking about Sagar, it was more about our immediate neighborhood. But when we talk about Mahasagar, the expansion of Sagar, then we are talking about the global oceans. So do you see the location is what it matters, be it Mauritius or any other country?
Mahasagar is expanded. It has connotations for the Indo-Pacific as well. Sagar initially was just restricted to, largely our neighborhood, Indian Ocean region, and so on. But the Mahasagar also is talking more in terms or using the lexicon which would be pertinent for the Indo-Pacific. See, for example, Mahasagar expands Sagar's cooperative vision to the global south, because Mahasagar is also talking about technology sharing, sustainable blue economy projects, naval diplomacy like ICMEI exercises, and that's an inclusive alternative to China's BRI. Now, India's model over the years, and especially now through the Sagar and Mahasagar, has been emphasizing regional ownership, which would not be the case when we are talking about BRI. We're also talking about capacity building or high impact community projects, Jan Aushadhi training programs, long term self reliance instead of dependency, and so on. So, all of these things are important from the Indo Pacific as well. So, which is why now Mahasagar, as you correctly said, has now become bigger. That is why probably while there is an acronym, mutually this thing, mutually and holistically acceptable, and Sagar and so on. But if you think of it from the lenses of Hindi, Sagar chota hota hai, but Mahasagar vishal hota hai.
Yes.
So this Mahasagar, while the acronym is also expanded and in English showcases a lot of different things, but also I think the Sagar se bada hai ya Mahasagar. Expanse has increased.
Okay, as you have shifted from how it is in Hindu philosophy or in Hindi, Sagar and Mahasagar. So the origin of Vish Amrit. So only Sagar Manthan has given us Amrit and Vish. Taking from there, what do you see or enlist as three achievements and three challenges India faced when it proposed Sagar in 2015 and now Mahasagar? So we have already spent around 10 years with Sagar. So what kind of Vish and Amrit we got from Sagar?
I'll first come to the Vish, because बाद में अमृत का ज़रूरत होगा ना, so पहले Vish. See, Sagar's biggest limitations have been in execution capacity or in institutional depth and economic scale. It doesn't have conceptual flaws per se. But here's the thing: when we do Sagar and when we are reaching out as a net security provider, it does incur economic pains, right? Now, India is also world's most populated country. We are a rising power. We are, well, industrialization is increasing and so on, right? How many of Indians pay taxes, direct taxes? So you see, that's a challenge over there. Capacity constraints, limit scalability. India has strong ambitions and capabilities in offering assets like patrol vessels or radar systems. But there have been things in the past which have limited timely delivery. The thing is, if we promise, we have to deliver, right? I think that can be scaled up, that can be worked out while we are figuring out the other thing. Also, what is needed is interministerial coordination and overlap amongst the agencies. What happens is that when there is less interministerial coordination, it leads to sometimes duplication of work or efforts. Efforts tend to get wasted. That leads further to slower project implementation, right? These are very, rational sorts of things which have happened because now India is playing the role. I would give credit to India and credit where it's due. This wasn't done earlier. So this is the first time that we are trying this thing, you know, and we are not the US or China, yet we are showing responsibility. So credit where it's due. Also, we've never really thought of this, not before 2010 or even 2014. So given that we, 2015 to 2025, I think it's we've done a laudable job. Generally we tend to end up comparing ourselves to China, which we should not. The world has given China a lot of time. Economically, how long has it been given to become the fastest, the manufacturing platform of the world? Deng Xiaoping's reforms, 1978 onwards, world started taking recognition of it largely around 2008, 2010, and so on. So do you see 1978 to 2010? This is how much time it was given. Secondly, Western powers, like the US, enabled its entry into the WTO, lobbied for 7 years for it. Do we have that support? We don't. We are on our own. And we are doing it all by ourselves in much lesser time frame. So I understand that given that we are also a developing country and within Asia, the world and we Indians also tend to compare ourselves with the PRC. But I would say we need to be a bit kinder with India. Whatever we've done in the last 10 years is it's been great. But again, one needs to also understand where the shortcomings are. If we could leverage private sector engagement under Mahasagar, that would expand the potential for leveraging Indian industry in blue economy projects or technology sharing or large scale connectivity initiatives and so on. Sagar has already delivered tangible results in trust building. The world does take cognizance of India as a trusted player. If it's HADR, anti-piracy, there's ample number of documented evidence as to what Indian Navy has done. Again, going back to Hormuz, because what can we do? We are stuck in the Hormuz and our minds are just stuck there. Indian Navy escorting our vessels. Like, how amazing is that? How many countries' navies have been successfully been able to do that sort of thing? So there is a need for enhanced trade, blue economy investments, technology sharing. So a better public-private collaboration, reduction in duplication of work, more interministerial cooperation or note sharing, I think would be a great step forward. Look, we've laid down the base. We just have to be a bit more patient and kinder, and not think that China has done great things. It has not. It suffers from several flaws. Both you and I have lived there for ample amount of time. I think India is doing pretty much well.
It is difficult to not name China whenever we talk about India and its neighborhood. If we look at China's BRI project, it is over $1 trillion placed globally. However, India's overseas infrastructure capacity is much smaller in that comparison. And there is a string of pearls narrative around China always. There are ports in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Djibouti, and China has poured hundreds of millions into ports and infrastructure across the region. So my question is, can Sagar or Mahasagar now compete without that kind of economic power?
Interesting question. Ports. Again, I'll go back to my theory because what to do? I just finished classes and came here. See, if a country wants to be the global hegemon, and China's real game is vis a vis the US, right? It wants to be the Middle Kingdom and the leader of the world order, it will have to focus on ports. The US has far more, bases and ports, etc., across the world. China is nothing compared to that, right? But China would want to build that. Now, China sees India as being US aligned. It is completely untrue. Maybe they do it to egg India or poke India or whatever, but largely they see us as Shifang coach, yeah, or to the western side and western and so on. Also because it has to keep India tied down to the neighborhood, so that its real game with the US keeps going on. It will create the ports. Also, as we now see, if you just look at, you mentioned Gwadar, right? If you look at Gwadar, I don't know how much of benefits it's got to Pakistan. Only I wish their field marshals and they would know. But objectively speaking, not much. How much employment has been created and not so much. But look, here's the thing: China prepares in advance. Till say 2 days ago, it would be safe to say that yeah, in the future eventuality of a crisis, China could use Gwadar port because it would connect to West Asia, it would connect to Europe and so on. But now that Hormuz is choked, there are certain reports which have come up that Pakistan is using, transmitting the oil from the ships overland. Now, if you see the line, well, touches Gwadar, uses Gwadar, and will go to the PRC.
Interesting.
So this is how they prepare for it. Myanmar, Kyakpao port. Myanmar also has oil reserves. There is a new civilian government, or that's what it's being reported. There's just been an election over there and so on. Now, China, to continue its industrial rise and be the manufacturing platform of the world that it currently is, whether or not it'll be in future, I don't know. What does it need? It'll need energy resources. So it's going to double down even in Myanmar and every other place that it has built ports in, right? Also, it itself has its Malacca Straits dilemma. If India and US come together, it's going to be problematic. So this is going to keep getting activated further. It just plans way ahead in time. It just probably does a lot of game theory, sits down and plots what are the options and so on. But it prepares way in advance for a rainy day. What do? Can we push back against this? Do we need to push back against this? We have to keep our own interests secure, of course. And yes, wherever there is a string of pearls, look, Pakistan is a separate question or a story altogether. It's a failed state, unfortunately. So not much can be done over there. But yeah, we can leverage our relationships, whatever we have with Nepal or Bangladesh, etc. And as we've done in the past, say that we have our red lines. Please do not cross the red lines. Can we build as many ports as them? Do we want to? I don't think India wants to topple the US or even China and become the world's leading actor and be the hegemon. That is not what our goal is. Our goal, I think our government's goal is to prioritize our people, our people's livelihoods, our people's sustainability, our people's development, access to job, access to food. It is not that sort of a mentality which the PRC has. So should we just to compete with them, forget all of this and do that? China can do what it does to its people because no one's going to question that. It's a one-party state. But that's not the case for democracies and definitely not the world's largest democracy.
So, Dr. Patak, if we have to bring a framework into this, what two different kind of framework is used by India and China? And do you think is India offering a genuine alternative model to in the Indian Ocean region, or is it actually operating at a structural disadvantage compared to China?
See, given that the world's two major powers right now have shown to the world that they definitely don't believe in the rules-based international order, if you look at Sagar and all that we have done, we have just tried to uphold the rules-based international order. We believe in the freedom of navigation, and that is exactly what Sagar has done so far. All the anti-piracy or sharing of technology, imports, and petrol vessels, and so on. I think we've proved it, India has proved it beyond the shadow of a doubt, that our approach is not transactional. The way China's is exploitative, or the way the US's is. So, unfortunately, amidst all of this crisis, it is difficult for the world order. I understand. But let's look at the silver lining. It's the best way to showcase that India's way is the correct way. I understand it is slow. Democracies are slow. We cannot behave like one state or an autocratic dictatorship and so on. But then if we have been able to create benefits for our neighbors, for our small partners, despite being at the receiving end of India out campaigns, does it not showcase the brilliance of India's diplomacy and our naval engagements and everything that we have done through the ages of Saga? A lot of times it gets difficult to measure the trust we've created or the value we have created. But when you go down to the people level and speak with the common people of these countries, you will see that, will this give us tangible benefits? Yes, it will. Because again, if I give you, say, let's go to Hungary, BRI projects and so on, EVs and BIDE and all of those things are going in. Are the people really happy? They are protesting. China gets its laborers in. When has India ever done that? We hire local labor, Ours is, again, this is my occupational hazard since I'm a professor. Think of it as a class, right? There are two, brilliant looking people, or let's say girls, my gender, two brilliant looking girls who are super cool, excellent in, spoken English and all sorts of those fancy things. And they're constantly at each other's loggerheads. They definitely look like they're from an affluent class, right? One of them, whose name is the US, has had a longer history of affluence. The other one, the name of which is China, is the new rich. Now she wants to be the super cool, the boss of the class and everything. And then there is one silent, very hardworking girl, constantly sitting and taking notes with oil in her hair. Just imagine every sort of Bollywoodish sort of picturization of the hardworking one. Let's assume she's from Bihar. Okay, it's constantly sitting and taking down notes, trying to understand what has the teacher really taught. Let me go through more notes. She shares notes also with the others, while these two keep squabbling. The rest of the class, there is an election, right? And the teacher says these three. So India is like, the girl called India is like, okay, why me? I don't understand. But she's been sharing her notes all the while. She's been helping out. She's been sharing her food, even though she cooks her own food and studies at the same time, right? Good girl syndrome. And then she's like, okay, I don't know how these two will take it. Maybe I should not. And has an underconfidence. But when the teacher asks the class, out of these three, which one would you want? The majority says, these two squabble a lot. And they create hassles for us also. It's either, it's dividing us. You are in my sphere, you are in my sphere. Or, bullying the other one's allies and friends. As compared to that, this one doesn't do that. She is Vishwa Bandhu. That's where we are. The good girl syndrome is what India has.
Okay. So I hope our audience will understand this oversimplification of India, US, and China. Do you think smaller countries, as you were right now telling about trust and mistrust among two different nations, are these smaller countries hedging between India and China rather than choosing?
They do. They very often do. Look, rationally speaking, every country will have to leverage whatever it has to its advantage, right? So our smaller neighbors, they've often done it in the past, that they play the India card against China or they play the China card against India. We've got amples of examples from Nepal, even from Bangladesh, even during the times of Sheikh Hasina, which was seen as more favorable to India. But if you look at the stats of defense, India wasn't the largest defense partner. It was China, right? So this has happened in the past. Now, for these countries which are seeking aid, investment, loans, or whatever sort of exports, be it tech or economic or whatever, what can they really do to get a better deal? they will hedge, they will pitch one country against the other. So that's what they have done. India understands that, which is why our diplomacy also over the years has undergone changes, trying to keep up with the newer thoughts or the newer sorts of tactics which our neighbors use. Logically speaking, it is understandable. They will do what they have to do. But every country loves its own national interests, so does India. So we also do what we have to do. We also politely tell our red lines. We engage in true partnerships. Since I mentioned Nepal, there are several BRI projects which simply didn't take off in Nepal, and four of them at least were handed over to India. There's a new government now, right now, of course, but even under the previous governments, that's just one example. Same case with Bangladesh. So look, these countries will hedge, and we have to understand that and just prepare better steps. Think of possible unfolding scenarios. So that's a rational behavior from a small state. So
So one is from the part of countries hedging, but if we look at the asymmetric defense budget between India and China, India has a defense budget of around $86 billion, and China has almost thrice of the same number. So do you think can Sagar or Mahasagar succeed without a much stronger economic component to it?
there will have to be an economic component to it, and over the years it has been increasing. Again, overnight it cannot be like China's, because our goals, our foreign policy visions are completely different. And since you mentioned the defense budget, look, defense budget also, simply increasing defense budget is not really going to be helpful. Let's not forget the fact that the last full scale war which China had with any country was in 1979 Vietnam. That too, it lost it, you know. As opposed to that, the Indian Army has had several experiences with our neighbor, our non state actor supporting neighbor, Pakistan. And it has acclimatized better to the extremes of colds in the Himalayas or etc. This is not to defend or justify the fact that we need to push in more budget or have more budgetary allocations. But here's also the thing, like, we, for example, right now have the Vibrant Villages program, right, against China's Xiaokang villages and so on. Xiaokang villages started much earlier. We started the Vibrant Villages program. There is budgetary allocation, infrastructural development in the Northeast. Sila Tunnel is just one example. Those sorts of things have started. Or the activation of the Nyoma Air Base last year. These are happening in tandem. Just bringing it down to defense budgets, I think, would be the wrong step forward. Going back to Sagar and Mahasagar, yes, there is a need for greater economic inputs, which is why, in answering one of your previous questions, I said, if we can have better public private partnerships, getting private players more and more for engaging with this whole theme of blue economy or trade will get us better advantages. I think it is being discussed, and hopefully there will be more action in this realm soon.
I think also one thing can be added as the framework we operates in. Like we don't have debt trap diplomacy kind of thing. We work on partnership, so we can have a partner with other nation, not creating debt diplomacy kind of debt trap kind of thing. So we have evolved in 10 years from Sagar to Mahasagar. I want to uh, have your opinion. What should Sagar look like over the next decade if it is to remain relevant and effective?
See, long term success, taking off from whatever we've built so far, will hinge on consistent execution, which will convert vision into more resilient partnerships. We have active partnerships, we have trustworthiness, and so on. But this has to be continued. And we have been able to leverage, India's geographic position, the proximity, the reliability, and so on. Now, success will also get measured in the next 10 years by whether Indian Ocean region and Global South partners consistently view India as their preferred reliable partner for security cooperation. We have done some great things in the realm of HADR in terms of capacity building, deepen strategic partnerships, but we have to ensure this continues. and that there will be newer challenges. We'll have to anticipate and prepare in advance, because see, over the long run also, a more secure, a stable Indian Ocean with reduced piracy or illegal activities or IUUs, illegal fishing, or maritime domain awareness, means well for everyone. These are going to become the flashpoints in the next 10 to maybe 15 years. Um, what India has to focus on is to somehow think of how do we continue delivering balanced results where security tools like naval diplomacy, exercises like Milan or ICMA enable more concrete economic outcomes. And we have to transition from this visionary framework to a more coordinated policy, which means more discussions needed between different ministries, agencies, people, and so on. What we also have to do is showcase that our leadership is differentiated. It is not extractive, it is not transactional. Positioning India as a responsible, inclusive maritime power has to be leveraged by showcasing whatever India has done within, utilizing Saga and our partnerships. That Neki Kar Darya Mein Dal is great, but it is also important one understands what one has achieved and showcases it. We all showcase our strengths. So that has to be done. We comply with UNCLOS, unlike our bigger neighbor, We focus on mutual growth. So these actually showcase it. And in the next 10 years, we have to continue delivering. We have to think of newer challenges which will pop up. We have to be adaptable to greater challenges, and maybe increase our presence further and further. Mahasagar has already expanded the scope, but now we need to think of, say, what do we really do if, God forbid, there is a Taiwan Straits crisis or some other crisis for that matter? Are we adequately prepared? Do our navies, of the Indian Ocean region and beyond, do we discuss these things, and so on? So I think in the next 10 years, these are just some of the things. I can just speak from the top of my mind, and whatever I think is doable and should be done.
Okay, so that brings to our last question, because you have mentioned that India is a net security provider. I just want to pick your brain that we should be net security provider or preferred security provider in the region.
Well, semantics matter, so I'm glad that you mentioned this. Um, Indian diplomacy probably would not showcase us as a preferred, because when you use the term preferred, we are pitching ourselves against someone else, right? Dr. Kumar is preferred to Dr. Pathak, right? Or say, out of this table, Dr. Kumar is the preferred one. So obviously there's a comparison. Do we want to do that? We don't bring in other countries. We showcase our power, or at least that's what I've seen Indian diplomacy doing over the last many years. We don't name names. We do our things. And definitely we have a name in our mind, but we don't do it publicly. Indian diplomacy is also mature that ways. So, which is why, in terms of semantics, it will be the net security provider, showcasing our net worth. It's not our gross overall worth, but the net, the real worth. You see how semantics come in here. So, we'll be the net security provider.
Okay. So, if there is one thing this conversation makes clear, it is this: the future of global power may not just be decided on land, but across oceans. Sagar and now Mahasagar reflect India's attempt to not just respond to this shift, but to shape it. But as we discussed, ambition alone is not enough. It requires capacity, credibility, and consistent engagement with neighbors who are navigating their own pressures and choices. Dr. Pathak, thank you so much for joining us and helping us unpack these complexities with such clarity. And to everyone listening, if you have enjoyed this episode, do follow The Long View. And please do watch our previous episodes with Ambassador Ashok Kantha, Professor Sugata Bose, Ambassador TCA Raghavan, and Professor Harsh Pant. We will continue to bring you conversations that go beyond headlines and help you see the bigger picture. Until next time, keep looking beyond the immediate and take the long view. Because in geopolitics, what matters most is not what happens today, but what it leads to tomorrow. Thank you so much. It was your host, Nishit. Namaste.
Thank you again, Dr. Kumar, and thank you, Subhash Chandra Bose, Chair for International Relations and Chanakya University.
Namaste.
Namaste.